At the bottom of the American continent, where the land tapers to a point and the freshwater Everglades meet the salt of Biscayne Bay, a city rose from swampland in a matter of decades and became one of the most photographed, mythologized, contested, and consequential places in the United States. Miami is only a little over 130 years old as an incorporated city, younger than the oldest living residents of many other American metropolises, and yet it carries within it more layers of history, more colliding worlds, more accumulated longing and loss and reinvention than places 10 times its age. It was built on land that belongs, in any honest reckoning, to people who were here long before the railroad arrived. It was raised by hands whose labor was never fully credited. It has been remade again and again by people fleeing disaster, oppression, and the wreckage of other places. People who brought their entire worlds with them and replanted them in subtropical soil. To understand Miami is to understand that the city Americans think they know, the neon, the beaches, the glamour, is only the outermost layer of something far older, stranger, and more deeply human. This is the story of Miami. Long before Julia Tuttle sent her famous orange blossoms north to a railroad magnate, long before any deed was signed or any hotel opened its doors, the land at the mouth of the Miami River was home. The Tequesta people had lived along the southeastern coast of Florida for at least 2,000 years, and possibly much longer. They built villages at the river's mouth, where the fresh water met the salt, fishing the bay and the Atlantic with skill and intimacy, moving through a landscape so abundant in protein and plant life that large-scale agriculture was unnecessary. Their world was organized around the water, the river, the bay, the ocean channels running between the barrier islands, and they understood its rhythms with the precision that only generations of accumulated knowledge can produce. The word Miami itself almost certainly derives from the language of the Tequesta and neighboring peoples, with most scholars tracing it to a word meaning big water or great water, a name that described the land's defining feature with more accuracy than anything the city's later promoters would ever invent. When the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century, Ponce de Leon among them, they found a population living in a functional civilization that had been in place for centuries. What followed was the pattern that repeated everywhere in the Americas. The newcomers brought diseases to which the indigenous population had no immunity, and within 300 years, the Tequesta had effectively ceased to exist as a people. By the time Florida passed from Spain to Britain in 1763, and then from Britain back to Spain in 1783, and then from Spain to the United States in 1821, the people who had given Miami its name were gone. The swamp and the mangrove and the sawgrass remained. So did the name. For most of the 19th century, the area that would become Miami was a quiet, occasionally violent, largely undeveloped corner of a young American state. The Seminole Wars played out across South Florida, with the United States government spending enormous sums of money and lives attempting to remove the Seminole people from territory they had made their own. Settlers came slowly, scratched out farms and citrus groves in the subtropical heat, and generally failed to convince anyone that the far southern tip of Florida was worth serious investment. The land was too hot, too wet, too insect-ridden, too remote. Everything about it discouraged permanence. What changed was a combination of a woman's conviction, a railroad magnate's calculation, and a stroke of agricultural luck so improbable that it passed into the city's founding mythology. Julia Tuttle was a widow from Cleveland who moved to the Miami River in the early 1890s, bought land on both sides of it, planted citrus groves, and became convinced, with a certainty that seemed irrational to almost everyone who met her, that this remote subtropical outpost was destined to become a great city. She spent years trying to persuade Henry Flagler, the Standard Oil co-founder, who had already turned Jacksonville and St. Augustine and Palm Beach into thriving Florida resort destinations, with his Florida East Coast Railway, to extend his line all the way south. Flagler resisted. He saw nothing in the Miami area worth the investment. Then, the winter of 1894 to 1895 arrived, and a freeze of unusual severity devastated the citrus crop across virtually the entire state of Florida. Temperatures dropped far enough south to kill trees that growers had planted years before. Almost everywhere suffered, but not Miami. The subtropical climate that sat at the tip of the peninsula was just warm enough to escape the killing freeze, and Julia Tuttle seized the moment. She sent Flagler fresh orange blossoms, still blooming in the middle of a catastrophic Florida winter, along with a persuasive letter about the land's unique potential. This time, Flagler agreed. He extended the railroad south. He built a hotel, the Royal Palm, on the north bank of the Miami River. He brought his infrastructure, his capital, and his organizational genius to the development of a place that had previously been too remote to matter. On July 28, 1896, the settlement at the mouth of the Miami River was incorporated as a city. Its initial population has been recorded as 444 people, though that figure depends on who was counted and how. Miami is often described as the only major American city founded by a woman, which is essentially accurate. Without Julia Tuttle's sustained pressure and her brilliant use of that freeze, the railroad almost certainly does not arrive, and without the railroad, nothing else follows. Flagler continued developing the region until his death in 1913, extending his railway all the way to Key West in 1912, in what was considered one of the engineering marvels of the era. Miami was his last great gift to Florida, and also the one that grew farthest beyond any vision he had for it. What the founding accounts rarely emphasize, and what the city's self-promotional history has spent decades obscuring, is that Miami was built by black hands. The workforce that graded the railroad, cleared the land, constructed Flagler's Royal Palm Hotel, and performed the grinding labor of turning a mangrove swamp into a functioning city was overwhelmingly African American and Bahamian. The Bahamians had a particular significance. Black settlers from the Bahamas had been visiting and periodically living along the South Florida coastline long before the railroad arrived, drawn by the fishing and the familiar tropical climate, and many of them had put down roots in the area of Coconut Grove years before Miami's incorporation. They brought with them carpentry skills, maritime knowledge, and a cultural tradition shaped by British colonial rule and a post-slavery freedom that gave them a self-possession that often surprised American settlers more accustomed to the brutalities of Jim Crow. Of the 368 people who signed the charter to incorporate Miami as a city in 1896, 162 were black. The city could not have been incorporated without them. Yet the moment the incorporation was complete, the same racial logic that structured the rest of the American South was applied to Miami with brutal efficiency. Deed restrictions prohibited black residents from owning property anywhere in the city, except a section designated for their use in the Northwest, which became known as Colored Town and later as Overtown. Jim Crow segregation governed every public space, every hotel and beach and restaurant and streetcar. The white-owned city was built by black labor and then organized to keep those laborers in a contained and controlled geography. What the black community built within those constraints, however, was extraordinary. By the 1930s and 1940s, Overtown had become what people called the Harlem of the South, a dense, vibrant neighborhood of black-owned businesses, theaters, hotels, churches, and nightclubs, where, because segregation barred black performers from staying in the Miami Beach hotels where they performed, the greatest musicians of the era gathered after their shows to play for each other and for Overtown's residents until dawn. Ella Fitzgerald played there, Billie Holiday, Nat King Cole, Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin. The Lyric Theater on Northwest 2nd Avenue was one of the most celebrated venues on the entire Southern Circuit. The community's sophistication, cultural richness, and economic self-sufficiency were a testament to what people build when they have no alternative but to build for themselves. In the years between the city's founding and the end of World War I, Miami grew steadily, if modestly. The real explosion came in the early 1920s, when a convergence of forces, post-war prosperity, the widespread adoption of the automobile, the completion of roads connecting South Florida to the north, and an aggressive campaign of real estate boosterism, produced one of the most spectacular land bubbles in American history. By 1925, Downtown Miami was so crowded with real estate agents conducting curbside transactions that sidewalks were impassable along Flagler Street. Speculators bought and sold parcels of Florida land by mail, often without visiting or even knowing the precise location of what they were purchasing. Prices doubled, then doubled again. Entire new communities, Coral Gables, Hialeah, Miami Springs, Opa-locka, were platted and marketed and partly built in the space of a few frenzied years. Miami was the fastest-growing large city in the United States, and its promoters told anyone who would listen that it was only going to keep accelerating. The reckoning came in September 1926. On the morning of September 18th, a Category 4 hurricane made landfall near Miami Beach with winds exceeding 150 miles per hour and a storm surge that topped 11 feet above normal high tide. The storm destroyed more than 4,000 homes, damaged thousands more, displaced 25,000 people, and killed hundreds. The land boom, which had already begun to stutter, under the weight of its own excess. Supply had begun to outrun demand. A sunken ship had blocked Miami Harbor for weeks in January. Building materials had been embargoed by overwhelmed railroads, collapsed entirely in the hurricane's aftermath. Florida entered its own private depression 4 years before the rest of the country did. Banks failed. Speculators were ruined. People who could leave left. But from that ruin came something unexpected. In the years following the crash and the hurricane, a generation of young architects, many of them recently arrived from the Northeast, trained in the new modernist aesthetic sweeping through Europe, began designing the buildings that would define South Beach's visual identity for the next century. Art Deco had debuted at the 1925 International Exposition of Decorative Arts in Paris, and its bold geometries, its optimistic embrace of modern materials, its decorative vocabulary of sunbursts and ocean liners and racing cars, arrived in Miami at precisely the moment when the city needed to project confidence it had no rational basis to feel. The buildings they produced along Ocean Drive and Collins Avenue, pastel-painted, horizontal striped, ornamented with neon and porthole windows and angular reliefs, were statements of defiance, monuments to the belief that things were going to get better. Miami Beach's Art Deco Historic District today contains the largest collection of Art Deco architecture in the world. It was built by people who had just survived a catastrophe. World War II found Miami before Miami found its footing from the Depression, and the war transformed the city with a speed and completeness that no peacetime development could have achieved. Local boosters persuaded the federal government that Miami's geography, its warm climate, its proximity to the Caribbean and to the shipping lanes of the Atlantic made it uniquely valuable as a training ground. The Army Air Corps established a massive training operation across Miami Beach, taking over hotels to use as barracks, clearing fields to use as runways, and deploying hundreds of thousands of military personnel through South Florida for the duration of the war. At any given point during the war years, more than half of the hotels on Miami Beach were under military occupation. The soldiers and airmen who passed through carried something with them when they went home, a memory of January temperatures warm enough to swim in, of beaches that seemed to belong to a different planet than the northern cities they had come from. In the post-war years, a remarkable number of them came back, and they brought others with them. The Jewish community of South Beach, which had been pushed by anti-Semitic housing covenants into the southern section of Miami Beach below 5th Street, grew rapidly through the late 1940s and 1950s, eventually comprising more than half the population of Miami Beach by 1950 and reaching an extraordinary concentration in South Beach, where Holocaust survivors and working-class Jewish retirees from New York built a community of such density and cultural particularity that the neighborhood sustained 6 Yiddish-language theaters simultaneously. Miami Beach in the 1960s and 1970s was, among other things, one of the most significant centers of Yiddish culture in the world, a fact almost entirely invisible in the city's popular image. Then came January 1st, 1959, and everything changed again. Fidel Castro's revolutionary government took power in Cuba and immediately began nationalizing industries, confiscating private property, and aligning the island with the Soviet Union. The people who had the most to lose fled first. Professionals, business owners, landowners, the educated middle and upper classes, who had built comfortable lives under the Batista government. Miami was the obvious destination, 90 miles away, already with a small Cuban community, warm and Spanish adjacent in its cultural atmosphere. The Cuban Refugee Program, established in 1961, provided federal assistance to the new arrivals. In the 15 years following the revolution, roughly 500,000 Cubans reached Miami in successive waves, making it the largest refugee resettlement in American history up to that point. They did not arrive intending to stay. The early exiles expected Castro to fall within months, and they organized their lives in Miami around the assumption of imminent return to Havana. They maintained Cuban schools, Cuban civic organizations, Cuban political clubs, dedicated to planning the liberation of the island. The Freedom Tower in downtown Miami, a Mediterranean revival skyscraper built in 1925 as a newspaper office, became the Cuban Assistance Center, the place where arriving families were processed and helped, earning it the nickname the Ellis Island of the South. Little Havana, the neighborhood west of downtown centered on Southwest 8th Street, known as Calle Ocho, transformed within a few years from a quiet residential area into a fully realized Cuban city within a city, dense with cafeterias and cigar shops and social clubs, and the sound of dominoes being slammed on outdoor tables in the evening. By 1970, the neighborhood was more than 85% Cuban. The exile community that had come expecting to leave in months had built, almost accidentally, something permanent. The Cuban transformation of Miami was not without its costs to the communities already there. The federal government's political investment in supporting Cuban refugees, driven by Cold War imperatives about demonstrating the failures of communist revolution, directed resources and attention toward the Cuban community in ways that the city's black population, which had been systematically marginalized since the city's founding, found infuriating. Overtown, the thriving black community that had survived segregation by building its own parallel world, was devastated by the construction of Interstate 95 in the 1960s, which was driven straight through the heart of the neighborhood. Thousands of residents were displaced. The Lyric Theater went dark. The nightclub district was demolished. What had been one of the most culturally vital black communities in the American South was bisected and scattered, its residents pushed into public housing in Liberty City and other areas, its commercial life extinguished by the machinery of urban renewal. In 1972, the first documented boatload of Haitian refugees arrived in South Florida, landing near Pompano Beach after a 3-week ocean crossing. They asked for political asylum and were turned away. It was a preview of what would follow for the next several decades. The brutal dictatorships of François Duvalier and his son Jean-Claude drove hundreds of thousands of Haitians from their island, and an increasing number of them made the crossing to South Florida on small, overloaded wooden boats, risking drowning and exposure for the chance of a life in America. The federal government's response to Haitian refugees was consistently and demonstrably harsher than its treatment of Cuban arrivals. Where Cubans were greeted with assistance programs and presumptive asylum status driven by Cold War politics, Haitians were detained, deported, and denied at rates far exceeding any other national group. Activists fought those policies through the courts for decades. Those who stayed and those who eventually gained legal status settled in the neighborhood north of downtown that became Little Haiti, building a community whose cultural intensity, its Creole language, its Vodou traditions, its music and art and cooking and fierce political engagement, transformed another corner of Miami into a piece of somewhere else. The mural at the entrance to Little Haiti, painted by the artist Serge Toussaint, depicts the neighborhood's founders in vivid color alongside Haitian revolutionary heroes and community icons. It announces, as clearly as any document could, that this place belongs to its people and holds their history. The year 1980 holds a particular place in Miami's memory, a year when 3 distinct crises arrived simultaneously and tested the city's capacity to hold together. The first began in April, when Fidel Castro, responding to a surge of Cubans seeking refuge in the Peruvian embassy in Havana, opened the port of Mariel to anyone who wanted to leave. In the months that followed, approximately 125,000 Cubans crossed to South Florida, in a chaotic flotilla of small boats, arriving in such numbers that the city's infrastructure was visibly strained. Among them were a small number of people with criminal records or mental health histories, whom Cuban authorities had deliberately included, a fact that was immediately seized upon by American media and used to stigmatize the entire population of Marielitos, most of whom were simply people seeking a better life. The second crisis had been building for months. On the night of December 17, 1979, a 33-year-old black insurance salesman and former Marine named Arthur McDuffie had been pulled from his motorcycle and beaten to death by a group of Miami police officers who then staged the scene to look like a traffic accident. When an all-white jury in Tampa acquitted all four officers in May 1980, after deliberating for less than 2 hours, Liberty City exploded. 3 days of rioting left 18 people dead, hundreds injured, and property damage that took years to recover. The verdict had confirmed what the black community in Miami had long understood, that the institutions of law and justice did not apply to them in the same way they applied to everyone else. The third crisis was already well underway, operating in the shadows of the other two. Since the late 1970s, the Colombian Medellin cartel had been using Miami as the primary entry point for cocaine into the United States. By 1981, Miami was responsible for handling an estimated 70% of the country's cocaine supply. The money was so vast and so physical, bales of cash arriving faster than banks could process them, that Miami's Federal Reserve Branch reported a currency surplus of billions of dollars, most of it in $50 and $100 bills, a figure larger than all 12 other Federal Reserve banks in the country combined. Murders rose from 349 in 1979 to 621 in 1981. The city morgue rented refrigerated trucks to handle the overflow of bodies. Miami had become simultaneously a war zone, a refugee camp, and an economy running on illegal money. What saved Miami, or at least what initiated its salvation, came not from government or planning, but from aesthetics. In the late 1980s, a preservation activist named Barbara Capitman had spent years fighting to prevent the demolition of the Art Deco buildings of South Beach, which a combination of age, neglect, and development pressure had reduced to a collection of faded, run-down residential hotels inhabited mostly by elderly Jewish retirees. In 1979, her efforts succeeded in getting the South Beach Art Deco district listed on the National Register of Historic Places. That designation, combined with the low rents that the area's decline had produced, began attracting photographers and fashion industry people who saw in those pastel facades and neon-trimmed cornices a visual language that resonated with the era's aesthetics. By the early 1990s, South Beach had become one of the most energized creative districts in the country. Gianni Versace purchased and elaborately transformed a crumbling 1930s apartment building on Ocean Drive into a palazzo he called Casa Casuarina, hosting celebrity parties and fashion shoots that drew global attention to a neighborhood that had been a retirement community a decade before. Supermodels worked the sand. Photographers came from everywhere. Music videos were shot on Ocean Drive. The nightclub scene that developed was among the most influential in America. The city that had, in 1981, been described by Time magazine as a place Americans were fleeing had become, by the mid-1990s, the place they most wanted to be seen. Art Basel arrived in Miami Beach in 2002, bringing the world's most prestigious contemporary art fair to a city that a decade earlier had barely a dozen commercial galleries. Today, Art Basel Miami Beach is one of the most significant art events on Earth, drawing collectors, curators, artists, and galleries from more than 90 countries every December. In 2009, a developer named Tony Goldman seeded the transformation of Wynwood, a former industrial neighborhood of warehouses, by commissioning large-scale murals from some of the most celebrated street artists in the world. The Wynwood walls became an outdoor museum, and the neighborhood around them became a global destination for art, food, and creative culture that generates millions of visitors annually. Miami today is something that did not fully exist before, an American city that is simultaneously a Latin American capital. Its population is majority Hispanic, with the largest Cuban-American community in the United States at its core, surrounded by communities drawn from every country in the Caribbean and Central and South America. Spanish functions as a co-equal public language in a way that is matched in the United States only in a handful of border cities. The Brickell neighborhood has become one of the most important financial centers in the Americas, housing the regional headquarters of banks and multinational corporations that use Miami as the gateway between the United States and the economies of the Southern Hemisphere. The Port of Miami is the largest cruise port in the world. Miami International Airport handles more international passengers than any other airport in Florida and connects the city to Latin America with a density of routes that makes it the de facto aviation hub of the hemisphere. And yet, Miami faces a threat more fundamental than any it has encountered before, one that no amount of cultural reinvention or financial ingenuity can be fully negotiated away. The city sits at an average elevation of roughly 6 feet above sea level, built on porous limestone that allows the ocean to rise through the ground as easily as over it. Sea levels in South Florida are rising faster than the global average. King tides regularly flood the streets of Miami Beach and Brickell with seawater on sunny, cloudless days. A phenomenon that would have seemed fantastical to Julia Tuttle or Henry Flagler. The city is spending billions on pump systems and raised roads and seawalls, fighting an enemy that cannot be defeated by the engineering approaches that built it. In the neighborhoods of Little Haiti, the connection between climate change and inequality has become especially pointed. Little Haiti sits at one of the higher elevations in the city, roughly 10 feet above sea level, and that relative safety from flooding has made it a target for the kind of real estate investment that is already pricing out the families who built the community and sustained it through decades of hostility. The people who fled disasters elsewhere and made their home in Miami are now being displaced by a disaster that is moving more slowly, but no less surely. A city born of a woman's conviction about a piece of ground that almost no one else believed in has spent its entire existence proving the doubters wrong and then confronting the next impossibility. The Tequesta called the water big. The Spanish mapped it and moved on. The railroad made it accessible. The hurricane tested it, and the Art Deco buildings rose from the wreckage. The Cuban Revolution remade it. The Haitian Exodus enriched it. The cocaine years nearly destroyed it. The fashion photographers rediscovered it. The art world consecrated it. And now the ocean is coming for it, slowly, inexorably, on sunny days and rainy ones alike, with an indifference to human desire that even Miami, the city of perpetual reinvention, has not yet figured out how to charm.